Presented by First Group. What is literature? What is text?
In most cases, literature is referred to as the entirety of written expression, with the restriction that not every written document can be categorized as literature. Usually include additional adjectives such as aesthetic or artistic to distinguish literary works from texts of everyday use, such as telephone books, newspaper, legal documents, and scholarly writings. Etymologically, the Latin word literatura is derived from littera, letter, which is the smallest element of alphabetical writing. The word text is related to textile and can be translated as fabric. Just a single thread form a fabric, so words and sentences form a meaningful and coherent text. The origins of the two central terms are not of great help in defining literature or text. It is more enlightening to look at literature or text as cultural and historical phenomena and to investigate the conditions of their productions and receptions. The earliest manifestations of this creative wish are prehistoric paintings in caves, which hold encoded information in the form of visual signs. This visual component inevitably remains closely connected to literature throughout its various historical and social manifestations. Not only the visual writing is always pictorial, but also the acoustic element. The spoken word is an integral part of literature, for the alphabet translates spoken words into signs. Before writing developed as a system of signs, whether pictographs or alphabet, texts were passed on orally. This predecessor of literary expressions, called oral poetry, consists of text stored in a bard or minstrel memory, which could be recited upon demand. Methods of literary and textual criticism are frequently applied to the cinema and acoustic media. Computer hypertext and networks, such as the Internet, are the latest hybrids.
Genre, text type, and discourse.
Genre. The term genre usually refers to one of the three classical literary forms of epic, drama, or poetry. This categorization is slightly confusing as the epic occurs in verse 2 but is not classified as poetry. It is, in fact, a precursor of the modern novel, that is, prose fiction, because of its structural features such as plot, character, presentation, and narrative perspective. Although this old classification is still in use, the tendency today is to abandon the term epic and introduce prose fiction or prose fiction for the relatively young literary forms of the novel and the short story. Text type. Beside the genres which describe general areas of traditional literature, the term text type has been introduced under the influence of linguistics. Texts which cannot be categorized under the canonical genres of fiction, drama, and poetry are now often dealt with in modern linguistics. The term text type refers to highly conventional written documents such as instruction manuals, sermons, obituaries, advertising texts, catalogs, and scientific or scholarly writing. It can, of course, also include the three main literary genres and their subgenres. genres. Discourse, a further key term in theoretical treatises on literary phenomena, is discourse. Like text type, it is used as a term for any kind of classifiable linguistic expression. It has become a useful denotation for various linguistic conventions referring to areas of content and theme. For instance, one might speak of male or female, political, sexual, economic, philosophical, and historical discourse. The classifications for these forms of linguistic expression are based on levels of content, vocabulary, syntax, as well as stylistic and rhetorical elements. Whereas the term text type refers to written documents, discourse includes written and oral expression. Summary of genre, text type, and discourse. In sum, genre is applied primarily to the three classical forms of the literary tradition. Text type is a broader term that is also applicable to non-canonical written texts, that is, those which are traditionally not classified as literature. Discourse is the broadest term, referring to a variety of written and oral manifestations which share common thematic or structural features. The boundaries of these terms are not fixed and vary depending on the context in which they appear.
Primary and secondary sources.
Primary sources. Traditional literary studies distinguish between the artistic object or primary source and its scholarly treatment in a critical text or secondary source. Primary sources denote the traditional objects of analysis in literary critiques, including texts from all literary genres such as fictions, poetry, or drama. Secondary sources. The term secondary source applies to texts such as articles or essays, book reviews and notes, brief comments on a very specific topic, all of which are published primarily in scholarly journals.
In terms of content, secondary literature tries to uphold the standard of scholarly practice which have, over time, been established for scientific discourse, including objectivity, documentation of source, and general validity. It is vital for any reader to be able to check and follow the arguments, results, and statements of literary criticism. As the interpretation of text always contains subjective traits, objective criteria or the general validity of the thesis can only be applied or maintained to a certain degree. This can be seen as the main difference between literary criticism and the natural sciences. The reader of a secondary source should be able to retrace every quotation or paraphrase to the primary or secondary source from which it has been taken. Although varying and subjective opinion on text will remain, the scholarly documentation of the source should permit the reader to revert back to the original text and thus make it possible to compare results and judge the quality of the interpretation. As a consequence of this convention in documentation, a number of formal criteria have evolved in literary criticism, which can be summarized by the term critical apparatus, which includes the following elements: footnotes or endnotes, providing comments on the main text or reference to further secondary or primary source, a bibliography or list of works cited, and possibly an index. Form of secondary source, among others, essay, article, note, book review, review article, and monograph. Publishing media form secondary literature, among others,
journal, anthology, manuscript, and book. Formal aspects of secondary literature, among others, footnotes, bibliography, index, and quotation. Aspect of content of secondary literature, among others, objectivity, lucid argument, general validity of thesis.
The strict separation of primary from secondary sources is not always easy. The literary essay of the 17th and 18th centuries is a historical example which shows that our modern classification did not exist in rigid form in earlier periods. From a modern perspective, therefore, the literary essay bridges two text types. In the 20th century, the traditional classification of primary and secondary sources is often deliberately neglected. A famous example from literature in English is T. Eliot's modernist poem The West Land, in which the American includes footnotes in the primary text. The absence of a critical apparatus or an overtly literary style are incorporated in secondary texts. The strict separation of the two text types is therefore not always possible. Vladimir Nabokov's novel Pale Fire is an example of the deliberate concession of text types in American literature. In the case of Pale Fire, however, all text types are created by the author Vladimir Nabokov himself, who tries to point out the arbitrariness of this artificial categorization of primary and secondary sources. The fact that this text is named a novel, even though it has a poem at its center, calls attention to the relativity inherent in the traditional categorization of genres. We think that's all, and thank you.